So for this lecture, we will be looking at media anthropology, or how do anthropologists essentially define or examine different forms of media and different forms of art. So an example I like to use, or kind of to introduce everyone to the kind of intersection between culture and artwork, is this little mini town that comes from Rio de Janeiro. It was started in the 1990s, and it's essentially a miniature city model with children from the local neighborhood who built this city, essentially, placing little avatars. Essentially, the child chooses something, whether it's a bottle cap or a small figurine or a clothespin or some sort of totem that or avatar that represents the child within the game, right? So it's essentially an imaginary game on a very large scale, right? And they make this little city out of all sorts of different things, discarded bricks and other little pieces of garbage and things like that. So the question really is can there really be an anthropological analysis of this game, right? It's kind of this interesting phenomenon that all of these neighborhood kids who, don't have access to kind of toys and some of the other kind of activities that, children in kind of more affluent countries have access to. They kind of created, through this kind of pretty miraculous piece of artwork, their own kind of little city in which they play out this game. So there was a anthropologist named Alessandro Angelini that looked at this kind of phenomenon, and he actually discovered reflections of poverty, class, culture, and politics that were being played out by these children with their avatars within the city, right? So in essence, what they were doing was mirroring in their play the society that was around them. So the central questions that we'll be dealing with in this presentation is what is art, right? How do we define art? How do anthropologists study art? How is power expressed in artwork? And how does art and media intersect? So in essence, kind of the examination of art from an anthropological perspective has kind of involves a kind of shift in the way we view art, or kind of the way we define art, right? It involves a shift in paradigms. So finding individual style in small-scale societies was once really considered to be impossible, right? And so we kind of place a little bit more of an emphasis on function rather than individual style, right? So there's been a recent change to comparative analysis within individual cultures to ascertain individual style, right? So it's kind of interesting. And just to give you one of my favorite pieces of artwork here is good old Teddy Roosevelt killing Sasquatch with a machine gun. So it's kind of very difficult to define art. So in terms of the anthropology of art, we kind of look at a very broad definition, right? Because aesthetics and styles will vary quite dramatically cross-culturally. Art in and of itself is both created and received, right? There's meaning and emotion and purpose in the creation of that art by the artists themselves, but there's also meaning derived and varying perceptions of that art by those who view it, by those who receive it, right? So if we were really to define art or to place a definition on art, we would say it's all ideas, forms, techniques, and strategies that humans employ to express themselves. So when examining art, we kind of make a distinction in anthropology between decorative versus emotional art, right? Decorating utilitarian objects, such as pottery, such as blow dart guns or weapons, also kind of eating implements, right? Plates, cutlery, things like that. All of decorating those kind of objects is very commonplace in many, many, many cultures, right? So decorative art is kind of this process of embellishing common day items like eating utensils or pottery, musical instruments, right? Emotional art, on the other hand, involves non-utilitarian kind of expressions of art, kind of like the one that you see featured in the photo on the right here, right? So emotional art is created for strictly aesthetics and emotional expression, and in some cases, ritual use. This is just showing you a few pieces of decorative art. We have the Zuni silverware featured down in the bottom there that's embellished with little pieces of turquoise. And then we also have a Nambiquara blow dart gun, which has actually been fashioned quite decoratively with a couple clay, actually a whole layer of clay and some molded decorations, as well as some little stones. We have kind of a version of decorative art in the United States, or kind of what is classically referred to as folk art in the United States, which is kind of featured here in this Southern Highland Folk Art Center in West Virginia. Folk art is kind of classically, it's exactly the same, right? It's essentially decorative art as well. Two of the earliest anthropologists that have kind of looked at art on a wide scale in terms of its cultural elements. Of course, we have Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, but we also have Claude Lévi-Strauss as someone who also looked into kind of aesthetics and artwork cross-culturally. So Franz Boas did his field studies among the Kwakiutl people, and we've talked about that, where we have talked about the Kwakiutl people several times throughout the semester. And he published his findings in the kind of work Primitive Art, right? And he concluded that art itself, of course, is part of his notion on historical particularism, right? That all art styles are unique within a given culture, right? So Kwakiutl art contained common themes such as warfare or mythical totems, as well as clan histories, right? So to Boas, art was a representation of the collective history of a group of people, right? So the aesthetic of the Kwakiutl people cemented their connections with nature, each mask that they make representing an animal and had features distinct to that animal, as well as if they weren't basically making a mask that mirrored kind of a natural element, they were making a mask that mirrored a spiritual element, and those spiritual elements were based off of animals as well, right? So animal masks were extraordinarily popular amongst the Kwakiutl. So essentially what Strauss looked at, because essentially since Strauss viewed culture as a kind of system, he viewed art as kind of part of a cultural system, right? So masks represent universal cultural aesthetics relating to notions of binary opposition, right? For example, the artistic rationale for the bulging eyes in the Swahi masks are the same as in the Zwe mask among the northwestern tribes, right? So for the Zwe mask and the Swahi mask, even though these two different types of masks are made in different groups, their basic rationale is the same, right? They represent the notion of good. They represent good spirits. And if you look at the Danzanokwa mask, it's an evil troll, right? And that actual mask is the same as well, right? Each tribe has its own version. So they both have these kind of binary oppositions that exist, right? Good versus evil, light versus dark, the sun versus the moon. Male versus female. So every culture, according to Strauss, and even in their artistic systems, all contain these kind of binary oppositions and universal rationales. So if we look at art as a form of visual communication, one of the earlier researchers on this was Anthony Forge from 1973, and he was kind of a pioneer in the field of what we call visual anthropology, which is essentially the making of visual ethnographies. And what he was concerned about how emotion and cultural values are transmitted through things like art, dance, and performance, right? All of these kind of visual elements of culture, right? So he studied the indigenous art of Arnhem land, which is in Aboriginal Australia. We also have Nancy Munn, who studied the Walbiri people of Australia, right? Both researchers concluded that art is comprised of visual elements which are ordered, right? So in essence, art follows kind of these cultural rules in terms of how it's displayed and how it's received, much like language does. So if we look at some of Forge's work in terms of Arnhem Land art, right, you can see where Arnhem Land is featured in the little map of Australia on the top right. And essentially Forge's work concluded that art, myth, and ritual meanings are all interdependent, right? So in essence, there are three ways of expressing the same cultural concept, right? You can express it with a word and action as well as in visual form through art, right? So if we consider an example, we have a syncretic piece of artwork here shown to the right. And essentially this is done in the kind of classic traditional Aboriginal and Indigenous art style, how they've done cave paintings, etc., for thousands of years. But this piece of art actually corresponds to a dance that recounts the introduction of Christianity to the indigenous people of Arnhem. So in essence, what we're looking at is kind of different expressions using kind of an ancient medium. So in essence, right, regardless whether we're looking at Aboriginal people in Australia or we're looking at African cattle tribes or we're looking at modern nation-state societies, right, every single culture interprets the world around them through the use of aesthetics and artwork as well, right? We can see these kind of artistic renderings of fish from 15,000 years ago in Australia. We can also get historic representations from artwork as well, right? This is a late 19th century Kuduku painting that's showing Europeans first getting to Australia. So if we look at art being used to interpret cultural contact, a good example we like to use is the Uaika, which is a tribe in the Amazon. And body painting is used as a way to communicate both between and within groups within this kind of tribal unit. And painting is also used to mimic mythic animals, right? Like we see the gentleman here is painted to mimic a mythic jaguar. Body painting is also used to internalize contact with Europeans. If we look at an example from Triste Tropiques, which is Strauss's work on Amazonian tribes, he actually wrote of a story where when European visitors first came down the Amazon, they saw these tribes that had their bodies painted. And when the Europeans made a return trip, they went to down the same river, saw the same tribal people, and had seen that the tribal people had painted British naval uniforms on their bodies, right? So they saw those sailors on their first trip wearing those uniforms and kind of internalized that contact and interpreted it and thought they were some form of mythic creature. So they turned around and painted those uniforms on their own bodies. It's kind of a very interesting way of how art was used, art and aesthetic, to internalize contact between two different cultures. Art can also be used to convey dynastic history here, like we see in this Maya, what they call a monument, a stela, which is actually a kind of limestone monument that's erected in the city squares. What we're looking here is actually an individual called Lady Shoke or Lady Shark. And what she's doing is conducting a summoning ceremony to summon her ancestor through the use of bloodletting. So essentially what she's doing is she's running a piece of rope that has thorns embedded in it through her tongue and collecting the blood in the little bowl in the bottom that you see there. And what they'll do is she'll burn that that blood and breathe the smoke in, and that'll cause kind of a visions and the ancestors to become kind of summoned that way. So what we're seeing here is an actual event, because bloodletting was a common kind of activity for the royalty in the Maya culture. So what we're seeing here is an actual retelling of a historical event, right? So art can be used to convey history as well. Art can also be used to communicate feelings on systems, right, or kind of to negotiate or make statements on systems of power within a culture, right? And political cartoons are kind of a perfect way, or satirical cartoons are kind of a perfect example of how art can be used to communicate feelings on systems or individual agents within those systems, right? So we can see here we have a cartoon of Trump with one button with the tweet and the other one with the nuke, kind of saying they're equally as disastrous. Then we also have one down in the bottom corner here, which is a U.S. map with Guns R Us, basically, so kind of criticizing us for being the largest arms manufacturer. So in terms of media and the media an artist can use or just to display art varies quite a bit. Art can be oration or storytelling. It can be painting, music, drawing, sculpting, recording. Remember when we defined art at the very beginning of this presentation, we had a very, very broad definition of art, right? And there's kind of a reason for that, because there's all sorts of different media that can be used, right? Media can use private spaces or personal biological materials. In essence, art is not limiting, but operates within cultural boundaries. So to give you kind of an extreme example of using biological materials for artwork, this is a portrait of Trump, or kind of an interpretation of Trump, that was painted using somebody's menstrual blood. So if we look at the anthropology of art itself, or the kind of anthropological study of art, it developed to kind of challenge Western notions of the value of art, or what essentially constitutes as art. So it studies how aesthetics is expressed in various cultural settings, right? And it dispels the notion that there is a difference between fine art versus popular art, right? It dispels the kind of qualitative assertions on the differences between primitive art and Western art. So essentially what the anthropology of art is doing is saying we don't get to place value judgments on what is considered master quality, high fine art, and what's considered just, regular art, right? All humans have the capability to express aesthetics, so all humans have the capability to produce art. So if we look at kind of this distinction that's been made between fine art versus popular art, it's a common distinction made among artists and, quote, cultural elites within a culture, right? Fine art is normally defined as the creative expression associated with formally trained cultural elites. Or you have popular art, which is creative expression associated with the general public, right? So this is kind of a qualitative association that anthropologists, in essence, reject. From the anthropological perspective, all members of society are capable of creating and expressing art, from formalized locations to mundane settings. So the questions really are, do all humans perceive art the same, or do they even agree on what is considered art, right? So the notion that all people share a generalized concept on what is considered art is known as the universal gaze, right? The aesthetic experience, of course, will vary cross-culturally, but the universal gaze is kind of this imperialistic, ethnocentric notion that doesn't really have any place in anthropology, right? So the only universal in art is that in all cultures, art mirrors or reflects life. So art can convey cultural information through the use of symbols. Here we see common symbols that are used in Amerindian Southwest or Southwestern Amerindian art. And when you see the kind of photo next that comes next, you can actually be able to pick out some of the elements that you see, and you can see kind of the cultural information associated with each of those symbols. So each culture has a particular kind of style, right? And if we look, we can consider these kind of pieces to the right here of indigenous Northwestern art, right? Styles can vary from 2D to 3D artwork. And the question really is individualistic style of a specific artist and cultural, right? Styles seem permeating within a whole culture, right? So there's kind of two different types of styles, right? You have individualistic as well as kind of cultural themes. So if we look at Boas's work on Kwakiutl style elements, he showed that these kind of mass, although mythical representations themselves, contained elements which indicate which animal they represent, right? So 2D representations as well all commonly have something called split representations, right, where it's kind of a mirror image on each half of the image, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in a moment. The prominence of the eyes reflect the importance of eye contact within Kwakiutl culture, and the leaving of negative space as natural wood reflects the natural connections that the Kwakiutl people have with nature. So what we mean by split representation in 2D aesthetics here is that in Kwakiutl art, we can draw a line going right down the kind of center of this image here, and it's almost a flipped or reversed image of itself, right? So each half here, I can just flip this over and it is the other half, right? That's what we mean by split representation. There are also certain styles which can have a wide geographic use. One of these ones that we see is the weeping eye motif. It's seen in dozens of indigenous tribes east of the Mississippi, including the Iroquois, the Cherokee, the Algonquin groups, and the Muskogee groups as well. And the weeping eye has kind of this universal meaning among indigenous groups as representing the thunderbird, which is a kind of overall deity. So art styles can also have individualistic elements, right? If they can also represent kind of individual preference, right? If we look at an example, we have Bill Reed, who popularized Haida art. style, using his own kind of style in concert with traditional Northwestern motifs, right? So in antiquity, the artist class arises usually in a society when food surpluses arise. So you don't really see a whole lot of artistic creation in terms of exclusively producing art until you get to more complex societies that have food surpluses. Art can act as cultural dialogue as well between two cultures. We've already kind of talked about one example of two cultures coming into contact and using art to kind of interpret that context, but it can be used to create cross-cultural dialogue, like King Ctesiphon of the Yoruba sent a divination tray which was used in blood rituals amongst the Yoruba to King Philippe IV of Spain in 1659, right? So the tray portrays the Yoruba cosmos. So in essence, what happened is when these missionaries went to the Yoruba, Yoruba kings saw how important the Bible was to them and how reverently they treated that book. And they gave him a copy of the Bible. So he wanted to gift the king something amongst the Yoruba that held equal cultural importance. So this is why he chose the divination tray. So we can see how there's a little bit of cross-cultural communication and cross-cultural dialogue going on with the exchange of these kind of artistic items. Art can also work to convey cultural norms. One thing that we see is these Poro masks. They're thought to represent very powerful supernatural beings. Some are thought to represent the spirits of the dead. And people accused of crimes in the Poro would actually be brought in front of these masks for judgment, right? So in Poro culture, the masks represent real physical beings which can affect the world around them, right? So cultural expectations about appropriate behavior were reinforced through fear of being brought in front of these masks and being affected by these very powerful deities. So if we were to kind of define a philosophy of aesthetics or define aesthetics, we would say it's kind of a set of principles concerned with the nature and appreciation of beauty, especially in artwork, right? So in essence, it is a study of what humans consider to be beautiful, right? How composition, lighting, color, actions, and fluidity affect concepts of beauty cross-culturally, right? So the question is really, is there such a thing as a universal aesthetic? If we look at one study that's kind of interesting, we have the Child and Sirota aesthetic study from 1965. Irvin Child and Leon Sirota conducted this kind of aesthetic or this test to study this notion of the universal aesthetic, right? So they showed Bakwele masks to the Bakwele elders and as well as Yale graduate students who were unassociated with the Bakwele culture. Both groups ranked the masks based on visual appearance, and the conclusion was that there was actual significant agreement between both groups on what is considered aesthetically good or what's considered beautiful. So when did art first start? Well, the evidence for art could potentially go back as far or as early as Homo erectus, one of our ancient kind of relatives in the island of Java around 140,000 years ago. Researchers have uncovered shells that have distinct patterns scratched into them, right? And the kind of argument is that those patterns couldn't have possibly been done naturally or by any natural means. So they're trying to figure out, did Homo erectus actually have the ability or the mental or intellectual capacity to create art? If we look at some other kind of cave art that we see or other early forms of art, we have Blombos Cave. Archaeologists there uncovered bone tools for mixing paint and stone tools for pounding red and yellow ochre, which are these kind of stone pigments. These materials themselves date to around 100,000 years ago. And essentially how they used this ochre was they would mix animal fat, melted animal fat, with the ochre pigments and charcoal, and this was used as kind of a paint when they did cave paintings. So some would argue that the Tantan sculpture, which is around 600,000 years old, is the earliest form of art. Unfortunately, it's not really confirmed because when they did microscopic analysis on the piece, they really didn't show any tool marks or human markings, but it was found in the same kind of archaeological layers with some stone tools as well. We also have the Barakat Ram as the first kind of deliberate sculpture that we have. Dates to around 280,000 years ago. It's made of volcanic scoria, which is a volcanic stone. It supposedly resembles a woman, and the lines that are around the neck that you can see up there, kind of towards what you would really see as kind of the head there, those were definitively made by humans, right? The microscopic wear analysis shows that the marks were deliberately made by tools. A little more recent time, we have some Ice Age or some Pleistocene period art found in the Dordogne region in France that dates to around 27,000 BP. And this is considered kind of a fertility statue. And this is really kind of one of our first examples of like, this is really, boom, true sculpture here. So if we look at the ethnography of art, right, in many smaller communities, art is a way for them to kind of engage with the global economy through the sale of their artwork, right? So anthropologists of art will study how objects of art travel through the global economy, right? They also study how in some cultures authenticity may be manipulated or manufactured. For example, traders in the markets of Côte d'Ivoire, right, the Ivory Coast, will rub dirt on art objects to make them look old and more antique. So to kind of wrap up just kind of how we define or look at the study of art from an anthropological perspective, right? So anthropologists who study art work to illuminate how smaller cultures use their aesthetics and art forms to interact with larger cultures. And remember, there's really no qualitative way to assess art cross-culturally, right? Instead, anthropologists investigate the relationships that exist between art and culture. So let's take a look real quick at how the notions of art and power intersect as well. I mean, you can kind of see it there in the Banksy photo or the Banksy piece of art on the right there. So anthropologists may examine the kind of intersection of art and power or cultural elements such as class, gender, or race. They will examine how creative expression interacts with political systems and cultural norms as well. So if we look at an example of how art and power intersect, we have the notion of these rah-rah bands that exist in Haiti. They have this kind of ruckus musical marches through poor communities during the week approaching Easter, right? So actually coming up here shortly. So each rah-rah band is a highly organized kind of unit with formal masks, ranks, and costumes. The music played and the songs that are sung are used as kind of social commentary, right? So these marches provide open, socially acceptable space for the poor to voice political sentiments and most likely political dissent where it otherwise would not be considered acceptable. We also have kind of umbrellaed under the notion of the anthropology of art is this notion of ethnomusicology, right, which is the study of music within a cultural context, right? This also involves the recording and preserving of cultural music, like we see here with Margaret Mead recording some Amerindian war songs. So if we look at how art and media kind of intersect here, the global mediascape is essentially made possible by forces like the internet. So more cultural media or art can be shared across cultural borders more now than ever before. So out of this kind of arose visual anthropology, or this field of anthropology that focuses on tracing how images move throughout cultures, right? So things like social media enable cultural images, videos, and performances to cross geographic barriers and be shared with people of many different cultural backgrounds. So social media, of course, we all know includes online forums, virtual avatars, online platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, et cetera, et cetera. So if we look at kind of some of the debates that spur around kind of the examination of art, especially when we get to objects that are pieces of art that are considered old or antique or even artifacts, right? It really goes back to the question of who owns art, right? This is something in archaeology that we call, or in anthropology referred to as cultural patrimony, right? These are objects possessing continuing cultural, traditional, or historical importance to the heritage of a group of people, right? This always includes burial objects as well as works of art, both utilitarian and non-utilitarian, right? And we talked about this a little bit with the passing of NAGPRA, right? This kind of notion of cultural patrimony is actually addressed and protected under NAGPRA. But an example that I like to use is these Zuni War Gods, right? Out in the kind of Zuni territory in the American Southwest, they would place these war gods on the kind of exterior of their geographic borders, right? And the war gods were kind of meant to ward off bad spirits. Well, archaeologists came along and started stealing them and selling them into art markets and to museums. So most of these Zuni war gods, which are extraordinarily sacred objects to the Zuni, were stolen and sold in the late 19th and early 20th century. Over 24 museums in the U.S. held them for close to 100 years, right? And what's unfortunate about this is that the Zuni people were forced to reveal religious practices in order to prove that the Zuni war gods were theirs, right? So this was technically considered a success for that NAGPRA legislation, but it's still, in terms of kind of cultural conflict, this wasn't very successful, right? We forced these people to sacrifice a piece of their cultural knowledge in order to give them back something that was already theirs. So the question is, why is owning the past important, right? Why do we seek these artifacts? Why do we have museums? Why do, when revolutionary groups go into an area, why do they target museums and artifacts? Well, it's because when you own the past, it gives you kind of the ability to legitimize your own rule, as well as legitimize your control over the current and future of the group in which you're existing or the culture in which you're existing. So owning the past is extremely important in solidifying political power. So to kind of wrap up art and media here, so be sure to review the case studies in visual anthropology that were mentioned, the ones we didn't talk about in the lecture here. Consider what culture the images you see come from, right? The internet has an immensity of culturally diverse media, right? And consider how culture is transmitted through things like imagery and performance as well. And to kind of the next few slides here is kind of my parting this is going to be the last lecture for your kind of material for the semester. I just kind of have a few quotes or sayings that I would like to impart to you as kind of future students and on your kind of future endeavors in your lives. So the first quote comes from one of my personal favorites, right? Carl Sagan, right? A great astronomer and scientist. And he says that science itself is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge. And another one from Carl Sagan saying that skeptical scrutiny is the means in both science and religion by which deep thoughts can be winnowed from deep nonsense, right? So really what Sagan's saying here is that we should be skeptical no matter what. It's what pushes us forward. It's what allows us to innovate. It's what allows us to drive our cultural development. And this one from Albert Einstein, only two things are infinite, the universe and human stupidity, and I'm not so sure about the former. Or one from a famous science fiction writer, Isaac Asimov, right? The saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom, right? And I think we're actually dealing with that right now with some of the reactions to the coronavirus that we see. Here's one from the rocket scientist, Wernher von Braun. Research is what I'm doing when I don't know what I'm doing. And from Neil deGrasse Tyson, a member of the American National Academy of Sciences, right? Once you have an innovation culture, right? Even those who are not scientists or engineers, people like poets, actors, journalists, they as communities embrace the meaning of what it is to be scientifically literate. They embrace the concept of an innovation culture. They vote in ways to promote it. They don't fight science and they don't fight technology, right? And what really Tyson is saying is that we really shouldn't be so resistant to change via technology. And just as kind of, we have to throw in our wonderful militant biologist Richard Dawkins here, and he says, of course, in science there are things that are open to debate and things need to be discussed. But amongst the things that science does know, evolution is about as certain as anything we do know. And kind of my favorite quote from Martin Luther King Jr. and one of the kind of most salient ones in terms of how our global economic and kind of political systems operate today is that, a country which spends more of its wealth on bombs, guns, and other implements of war rather than on programs of social uplift is a country that's approaching spiritual death. So, in essence, my kind of parting thoughts to you, all of my students for this semester, and what I hope you take with you as you kind of conclude your foray here into cultural anthropology and you move on to your careers, is that you should always be skeptical, right? Once you stop being skeptical of those in authority, whether they're your parents, whether they're your government leaders, whether they're your religious leaders, right? Any of those cultural leaders, right? Once you stop being skeptical of those in authority, then you're up for grabs, right? And of course, gain as much experience in college as possible, right? The more knowledge you obtain, the more worth it the debt becomes, right? So demand more from your government and your leaders, right? If we are not working towards a better society, then we'll all ride to oblivion and complete complacency, right? We should all be, I tell you that evolution itself is not progressive, but culture is progressive, right? We're constantly changing it, constantly developing, right? So we should continue to work towards that goal of developing a cultural system or a degree of cultures on the planet where humans aren't exploiting one another, right? Where we can uplift everyone, right? And of course, treat everything and everyone with love, right? Life is too short to fill it with hate.